In 2023, the Salvation Army in Australia celebrated 140 years of social services. We did this by hosting an international social services conference with the theme, Everybody Has a Work to Do. The Salvation Army, a Christian movement with its sleeves rolled up. We wanted in that conference to remind ourselves of our history, our legacy, and to look towards the future. To honour this anniversary, the Salvation Army held a 4-day conference in Melbourne. It coincided with the leading up to the opening of the first program in the world, the Prison Gate Brigade, 140 years ago. Recognising that this anniversary is taking place at a time of considerable internal global reflection on the Salvation Army and its structures, and that the conference would then present material from speakers around the world on the critical area of social mission, we recorded as much of that event as possible. This series of videos includes the major keynotes from the conference and some material from associated sessions. As social mission is central to the Salvation Army's distinctive mission to the world, we trust these presentations will be of continued worth. The Prison Gate program, which began in 1883, was the first ever social program in the Salvation Army world. Major James Barker, concerned that men released from prison were going back to prison because of a lack of support and shelter, decided that something needed to be done. James Barker worked with then the colony of Victoria to provide a response. That early conversation with the colony of Victoria resulted in a fully fledged program and another first for the Salvation Army, which was its first ever government grant anywhere in the world. Edmund Barton, who was our first Prime Minister, but at the time Chief Justice, said in a speech in Melbourne, "Perhaps, however, there is an almost more valuable proportion of that work which cannot be told in any report, but which, from the lives and characters of those whom we know in the Army, is being tenderly and benignly done every day. I mean those little nameless acts of kindness and love which Wordsworth calls the best portions of a good man." That's a field which is coextensive with the whole work of the Army. At the prison gate, in the slums, with the starving, wherever the Salvation Army officers and soldiers are, of whatever sex they are, it's doing of these acts that, even more than any more substantial, brings rest to the weary and sin-stricken. It is in these that the philanthropic energies of the Salvation Army have found perhaps their highest expression, and it is by these that more lives than any of us know have been brightened. 140 years later, it is my fervent hope that the Salvation Army is still brightening lives for people. We are now the largest provider of social services nationally. The Salvation Army holds a unique place in Australia. It grew up with the nation, and because of that is embedded in the social capital and culture of Australia. Our unique relationship with the colony of Victoria results today in a very special relationship with government and Australians at all levels of society. In 1883, James Barker understood that the disadvantaged and vulnerable required support to thrive. In 2023, the Salvation Army continues that legacy of providing holistic support to the most disadvantaged and vulnerable. Every day, in a myriad of ways, vulnerable Australians encounter the love of God through the Salvation Army's social mission. The Salvation Army's social services are an integral and essential part of the Salvation Army. We are called to be Christ in the world, to provide the cup of cold water to the thirsty, the loaf of bread to the hungry, and indeed the gospel of Christ in action to the spiritually deprived. The Salvation Army social services are the outpouring of the gospel. William Booth famously said that you cannot give the gospel to a man with a hungry stomach. Today, our social services understand that people in crisis cannot hear the gospel, but they can experience it in the manner in which they are received by us when they seek that support. Both the human support and the spiritual support go hand in hand. They can't be separated, they are one and the same. By supporting crisis in a Christ-like way, we create an opportunity for people to have far more in their lives than food and shelter. We invite them into exploring a relationship with God. Today, our social services are delivered not just by Christians. We have a very diverse workforce of highly trained professionals. Each of these individuals are committed to the values of the Salvation Army. This means that when someone who perhaps does not commit to Christ in their personal life will continue to open the door of the Salvation Army with love and acceptance, they too become the hands of Christ in the world. It is my great pleasure today to offer you this series of keynotes and workshops from the conference. As social mission remains a central element of the Salvation Army's distinctive mission to the world, we trust these presentations will be of continued worth, interest, and that they challenge you to continue the work of the Salvation Army in the world today. Everybody has work to do, the work of Christ in the world that is in real need of the gospel. Now I'm going to introduce to you John Cleary, who is an historian of the Salvation Army in Australia. He's going to tell you a little bit more about the origins of the Salvation Army social services in Australia and some very interesting facts about James Barker and the Prison Gate Brigade.
Thank you, Major Begent. Well, according to leading historians of the Salvation Army, such as Robert Sandals and Frederick Coates, the Salvation Army's organised social work began not in East London, but in Australia in 1883. How then, say other historians, did this come to be when we can trace Salvation Army social work back to the early days of the Christian mission and things like the Food for the Million scheme? Well, what makes the Army's work in Australia so significant, William Booth himself described in 1911, and he put it this way: "I felt, and often keenly felt, that there surely must be some way by which, without any evil consequences, I could legitimately fulfil the cravings of my own heart, as well as comply with the commands of my Lord, who had expressly told me that I was to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, care for the sick, and visit the prisoners. For a long time, however, I failed to see how this work could be done in any organised or extensive manner. It was not until the end of 1883 or thereabouts that anything like a systematic effort in this direction was organised on their behalf. About this time, our first prison rescue brigade in the colony of Victoria was organised by the late Colonel Barker. So striking was the success attending his effort that before many months had passed by, magistrates in the city of Melbourne were actually giving delinquents the option of being sent to prison or to our prison gate home, and the government placed the former detective police building at our disposal at a nominal rent. It was upon such foundations of this character that our social operations in New Zealand, France, South Africa, and several other countries were subsequently built up. Barker had recognised the need for institutionalised social work. Booth recognised its value to the Army. As a matter of fact, he said, the Government of Victoria has long been taking the lead in recognising the secular uses of the Salvation Army. But James and Alice Barker had more to offer. They were not just the instruments of a single inspiration. They were a team, a partnership, Barker, the evangelical entrepreneur, and Alice, the calm, steadying instinct behind. And it was to that work that they were given over to the Darkest England scheme when William Booth recalled them to London in 1890. James, under the formal leadership of Elijah Cadman, took on the effective role of Chief of Operations in the implementation of the Darkest England scheme. In that position, he took up Catherine Booth's desire, expressed prior to her death, to reform the conditions of the match girls of England. Barker was responsible for the Lights of Darkest England project, and in a few short years effectively delivered Catherine Darkest England's first victory, when Bryant and May adopted safety matches, saving the world from the curse of Fossey Jaw. Barker also maintained his passion for prison work and saw a network of prison gate homes established around the United Kingdom. And after decades of work selling and developing the Darkest England scheme, he unfortunately contracted diabetes and was to die in 1901 on the eve of William Booth's first visit to an English prison. Undeterred, however, Alice Barker took on a wider role, rising to assist Florence Booth in the establishment of the worldwide women's ministries of the Salvation Army, including Women's Social Services. One of the initiatives was quite unique. An anti-suicide bureau, established at a time when suicide was a mortal sin. As a now widowed mother of 3 children, her domestic influence remained strong. This included an officer daughter and soon-to-be wife of the young Albert Osborne, who for some years was to live with the Barker family, and on Alice's death in the great influenza epidemic of 1917, wrote a significant tribute to her and her influence on his life and the development of his writing. But the influence of James and Alice was also evident in another Army general, George Carpenter, whose life was told by his wife Minnie Rowell as a gifted writer and champion of Army social work. In 1921, her book, 3 Great Hearts, featured the story of 3 notable social officers, one of whom was James Barker. And 10 years after, she contributed 2 short booklets, James Barker, The Prisoner's Friend, and Alice Barker, Friend of the Poor. This celebration then of 140 years of Salvation Army social work doesn't just commemorate a moment in time, but the continuing widespread influence of James and Alice Barker, 2 individuals whose influence for good continues to resonate.